October 7th, 1571. The Mediterranean Sea turns red with blood. 300 galleys collide in the largest naval battle the world has seen in over 1,000 years. 30,000 Christian rowers strain at their oars. 80,000 men prepare to kill or be killed. The thunder of cannons echoes across the water as the most powerful naval force ever assembled by the Ottoman Empire faces an alliance that shouldn't exist. By sunset, the Mediterranean will never be the same again, but here's what most people don't know. This wasn't just about religion. It wasn't just about territory. The real story of Lepanto is about a revolution in naval warfare, a technology race that had been building for decades, and one crucial advantage that would decide everything. The question isn't just who won at Lepanto. It's how a divided Christian alliance managed to break the undefeated Ottoman fleet, and it all comes down to the ships themselves. To understand why Lepanto mattered, you need to understand what the Mediterranean had become by 1571. For nearly a century, the Ottoman Empire had been unstoppable at sea. After conquering Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II didn't just take a city. He took control of the strategic choke point between Europe and Asia. The Ottomans now controlled both sides of the Bosphorus, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But controlling the straits wasn't enough. The Ottomans wanted the entire Mediterranean, and they were getting it. By the 1560s, Ottoman galleys dominated the eastern Mediterranean. They'd taken Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller in 1522. They'd pushed the Venetians out of most of their eastern holdings. They'd even launched raids on the Italian coast, terrifying coastal communities and carrying away thousands into slavery. The Ottoman fleet wasn't just powerful, it was growing. Every year, the shipyards of Constantinople, Gallipoli, and Alexandria launched dozens of new galleys. The Ottomans had perfected the logistics of naval warfare. They had the timber from the forests of Anatolia. They had the foundries producing bronze cannons. They had an endless supply of rowers from their vast empire. Most importantly, they had something no Christian power could match: unity of command. While Christian Europe was fractured into competing kingdoms, duchies and republics, all suspicious of each other, all pursuing their own interests, the Ottoman Empire operated as a single coordinated war machine. When the Sultan wanted a fleet assembled, it happened. No debates, no negotiations, no political complications. This mattered more than you might think. The Spanish controlled the western Mediterranean, but were constantly distracted by wars in the Netherlands and conflicts with France. The Venetians controlled crucial ports and trade routes, but were a commercial republic that preferred diplomacy to warfare. The Papal States had moral authority but limited military power. The various Italian states were too small to matter individually. Getting all these powers to work together was like herding cats. Wealthy, proud, suspicious cats who all thought they should be in charge. But by 1570, the situation had become desperate enough that even these fractious allies had to face reality. The trigger was Cyprus. Cyprus wasn't just another island. It was the last major Venetian holding in the eastern Mediterranean, a crucial link in the trade routes that made Venice wealthy. The island produced wine, sugar, salt, and cotton. More importantly, it provided a base for Venetian ships operating in the Levant. The Ottomans wanted it. In the summer of 1570, a massive Ottoman fleet of over 350 ships appeared off the coast of Cyprus. The invasion force included 60,000 soldiers, siege artillery, and everything needed for a major campaign. The message was clear. This wasn't a raid. This was conquest. The Venetians were caught off guard. Their forces on Cyprus were woefully inadequate. The main strongholds were Nicosia, the inland capital, and Famagusta, the main port. Both were fortified, but neither had enough men or supplies for a prolonged siege. Nicosia fell in September 1570 after a brutal siege. When the Ottoman forces breached the walls, they massacred 20,000 inhabitants. The Venetian commander was killed trying to rally his men. The city was systematically plundered. Only Famagusta remained, and it wouldn't hold out forever. Venice appealed desperately to the rest of Christian Europe for help. And this is where things get interesting, because the response tells you everything about the politics of the time. Spain was the obvious choice for an ally. King Philip II controlled the most powerful military in Europe, had a massive treasury filled with American silver, and possessed a strong Mediterranean fleet. But Philip was cautious. He was fighting rebellions in the Netherlands, watching France nervously, and dealing with Protestant England. Did he really want to commit resources to help Venice hold Cyprus? The Pope, Pius V, saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Cyprus. If the Ottomans took the island, they'd have a perfect base for launching attacks on the Italian coast, on Sicily, on anywhere they wanted. The entire Christian Mediterranean was at risk. Pius the Mime spent months negotiating, cajoling, and threatening various Christian powers to form a holy league against the Ottomans. It was exhausting work. Venice wanted guarantees. Spain wanted concessions. The various Italian states wanted money. Finally, in May 1571, the Holy League was officially formed. Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, the Knights of Malta, and several smaller Italian states agreed to pool their resources and assemble a fleet. But here's the problem. Assembling the fleet was only the first challenge. Someone had to command it. Enter Don Juan of Austria. He was only 24 years old. He was the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, and he was about to command the largest Christian fleet assembled in over a century. If this sounds like a recipe for disaster, you're not alone in thinking that. Many experienced admirals in the fleet were skeptical. The Venetians were especially nervous. They'd been fighting the Ottomans at sea for generations. What could this young Spanish prince, who'd spent most of his life fighting land battles in Granada, possibly know about naval warfare? But Don Juan had advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, he was energetic and charismatic. He genuinely believed in the mission and could inspire men to follow him. In an alliance held together by mutual suspicion and competing interests, that personality mattered. Second, he was politically acceptable to all parties. As Philip's half-brother, he represented Spanish interests. But because he was illegitimate, he wasn't threatening to anyone. He couldn't inherit the Spanish throne, so he wasn't pursuing a personal kingdom. Venice could accept him. The Pope approved of him. The various Italian states could work with him. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he was smart enough to listen to experienced advisors. His second-in-command was the veteran Genoese Admiral Gianandrea Doria, from one of the most famous naval families in Italy. His Venetian contingent was led by experienced commanders like Sebastiano Venier and Agostino Barbarigo. Don Juan knew what he didn't know, and he surrounded himself with people who did. When Don Juan arrived in Messina, Sicily, in August 1571, he found chaos. The Holy League fleet was assembling, but it was a mess. Spanish galleys mixed with Venetian galleys, mixed with Papal galleys, mixed with ships from a dozen different states. Every contingent had its own commanders, its own supply systems, its own ideas about tactics. The Venetians and the Spanish barely spoke to each other. Old rivalries and suspicions bubbled constantly beneath the surface. Don Juan's first task wasn't to fight the Ottomans. It was to create a unified fighting force out of this multinational fleet. He did something clever. Instead of treating each national contingent as a separate unit, he mixed them. Spanish galleys would fight alongside Venetian galleys, which would fight alongside Papal galleys. Officers from different nations would have to coordinate. Tactics would have to be standardized. It wasn't popular, but it was necessary. While Don Juan was organizing his fleet, intelligence reports were coming in about the Ottoman fleet. It was commanded by Ali Pasha, the Capudan Pasha or Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy. Unlike Don Juan, Ali Pasha was a veteran naval commander with decades of experience. His fleet was slightly larger than the Christian fleet, and his crews were battle-tested. Most concerning of all, the Ottoman fleet was aggressive. Ali Pasha wasn't planning to sit in port and defend. He was actively seeking battle. This was the moment of truth. The Holy League fleet could stay in Messina, wait out the season, and hope the Ottomans went home. Or they could sail east and seek battle. Don Juan chose battle. Now let's talk about the technology that would actually decide the battle. Because at Lepanto, ship design mattered just as much as tactics. Both fleets were built around the same basic vessel, the galley. If you're picturing the massive sailing ships of later centuries, forget it. In 1571, the Mediterranean was still dominated by oared warships that would have looked familiar to an ancient Roman admiral. Galleys were long, narrow vessels powered primarily by oars, with limited sail capacity for cruising, but not all galleys were created equal. The standard Mediterranean galley of 1571 was about 130 to 150 feet long and only 15 to 20 feet wide. This narrow profile made them fast and maneuverable, but also unstable in rough seas. They had a shallow draft, allowing them to operate close to shore and enter ports that deeper drafted sailing ships couldn't access. The rowing arrangement was crucial. By the 16th century, most Mediterranean galleys used a system called al sensile, where multiple rowers pulled each oar. A typical galley had 25 to 30 oars per side, with 3 to 5 men pulling each oar. That's about 150 to 300 rowers per galley. These rowers weren't volunteers. On Ottoman galleys, they were a mix of slaves, prisoners of war, and conscripted subjects. On Christian galleys, they were criminals sentenced to the oars, prisoners of war, and paid volunteers. The life expectancy of a galley rower was not good. They were chained to their benches, fed minimal rations, and expected to row for hours in blazing heat or freezing cold. In battle, they were completely exposed. No armor, no weapons, just flesh and bone in the way of arrows, musket balls, and cannon shot. But the real revolution in naval warfare wasn't about the rowers. It was about the guns. For centuries, galley warfare had followed a simple pattern: row toward the enemy, try to ram them or come alongside, then board with soldiers. The actual fighting was essentially a land battle fought on wooden decks. Archery was important, but the decisive moment came when armored soldiers clambered over the sides and fought hand to hand. Cannons changed everything. The first ship-mounted cannons appeared in the 15th century, but early models were small and unreliable. By 1571, cannon technology had advanced dramatically. Galleys now mounted heavy cannons in the bow, facing forward along the ship's center line. These weren't anti-ship weapons in the modern sense. They were meant to smash through enemy oars and kill rowers before the ships closed, giving the attacking galley a crucial advantage. And this is where the Holy League had a technological edge. The Venetians in particular had been innovating. They developed a new type of vessel called the galleass, a hybrid ship that combined the oared propulsion of a galley with the higher sides and heavier cannon armament of a sailing ship. A galleass was bigger, slower, and less maneuverable than a standard galley, but it could mount significantly more guns and provide a stable firing platform. Each galleass mounted between 40 and 70 cannons of various sizes. They were floating fortresses. The Holy League fleet included 6 galleasses, all Venetian. The Ottomans had nothing comparable, but the real advantage came down to the main armament, the center line. Cannons on the standard galleys, the Christian. Galleys mounted heavier guns than their Ottoman counterparts. A typical Spanish or Venetian galley carried a large cannon in the bow, often a 36-pound demi-cannon or even a full 50-pound cannon. These guns could fire a single heavy shot that would devastate an opposing galley at close range. The Ottoman galleys typically mounted lighter guns, often composite cannons that fired smaller shot at higher rates. Their philosophy was quantity over quality, more guns firing more often, even if each individual shot was less destructive. Both approaches had merit. The Ottoman guns could maintain a higher rate of fire, but the Christian guns hit harder. In the upcoming battle, that difference would matter. There was one more crucial advantage the Christian fleet had: arquebusiers. The arquebus was an early matchlock musket, heavy, slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short range, but devastating in massed volleys at close quarters. The Spanish in particular had perfected the use of arquebusiers in battle. The Holy League galleys carried thousands of Spanish and Italian soldiers armed with arquebuses. When galleys came alongside each other, these arquebus volleys would sweep enemy decks with lethal fire. The Ottomans relied more heavily on archery, which had advantages in rate of fire and range, but arquebuses hit harder and could penetrate armor that stopped arrows. So as both fleets prepared for battle, the technology balance was subtle but significant. The Ottomans had more ships and more experienced crews. The Christians had heavier guns, innovative galleasses, and more firearms. Now they just had to find each other. The Christian fleet sailed from Messina on September 16, 1571. It was an impressive sight. Over 200 galleys, 6 galleasses, and dozens of support vessels, carrying about 28,000 soldiers and rowers, plus 50,000 crew. The fleet stretched for miles across the water. Banners and flags flew from every mast. The cross of Christ was painted on sails and shields throughout the fleet. Don Juan had organized the fleet into 3 main squadrons, plus a reserve. He commanded the center. Agostino Barbarigo commanded the left wing with mostly Venetian galleys. Gianandrea Doria commanded the right wing with Spanish and Genoese galleys. The reserve, commanded by the Marquis of Santa Cruz, would provide flexibility and respond to threats. The 6 galleasses were distributed 2 each to the center and the 2 wings, positioned ahead of the main battle line. They would serve as mobile fortresses, disrupting the Ottoman formation before the main fleets engaged. But where was the Ottoman fleet? Intelligence reports were contradictory. Some said Ali Pasha was at Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth. Others reported he was raiding Venetian islands. Still others claimed he was sailing west toward the Christian fleet. Don Juan sailed east along the Greek coast, stopping at various ports for information and supplies. At each stop he sent out scouting vessels to search for the enemy. Meanwhile, Ali Pasha was indeed at Lepanto, and he was facing a dilemma. The Ottoman fleet was formidable, about 230 galleys plus support vessels, carrying perhaps 34,000 soldiers and rowers. It was slightly larger than the Christian fleet. Ali Pasha was a confident commander who'd won numerous victories against Christian opponents, but he'd also received disturbing intelligence reports about the Christian fleet. It was unusually large and well organized. The presence of 6 Venetian galleasses was concerning. The Ottomans had heard of these vessels but had never fought them. And the fleet was commanded by Don Juan, who might be young but had defeated a major rebellion in Granada. Some of Ali Pasha's officers advised caution. Perhaps they should wait out the season in port. The weather would turn bad in a few weeks, forcing both fleets to retire for the winter. Why risk battle when time was on their side? But Ali Pasha was under pressure from Constantinople. The Sultan expected victories. The Ottoman Navy had a reputation to maintain, and Ali Pasha's own honor was at stake. Could he really refuse battle and let a Christian fleet sail through Ottoman-controlled waters? He decided to fight. On October 6th, the Ottoman fleet left Lepanto and sailed west into the Gulf of Patras. Ali Pasha was looking for the Christian fleet. He found them. On the morning of October 7th, Venetian scouting vessels spotted the Ottoman fleet sailing west. They rushed back to Don Juan with the news. The enemy was coming, and they were close. The Holy League fleet was near the entrance to the Gulf of Patras, just outside the town of Lepanto. The dawn was clear, with light winds from the west. The sea was relatively calm, perfect conditions for a galley battle. Don Juan called a council of his commanders. This was it. They could engage or withdraw. There wasn't much time to decide. Every commander voted to fight. Even the cautious Venetians, who had the most to lose, agreed. They hadn't assembled this massive fleet just to avoid battle. Don Juan gave the order, prepare for action. Both fleets began deploying into battle formation, and this is where you see the tactical sophistication of 16th century naval warfare. The Christian fleet formed into a line roughly parallel to the northern shore of the Gulf. The formation stretched about 3 miles from north to south. Don Juan placed himself in the center aboard his flagship, the Real. To his left was the Venetian squadron under Barbarigo, anchored on the northern shore to prevent the Ottomans from outflanking them. To his right was Doria's squadron of Spanish and Genoese galleys. The 6 galleasses were positioned about 200 yards ahead of the main line, 2 in front of each squadron. They would serve as breakwaters, disrupting the Ottoman formation and absorbing the initial impact of their attack. Behind the main line, the reserve squadron under Santa Cruz waited to exploit opportunities or shore up weak points. It was a defensive formation. Don Juan was conceding the initiative to the Ottomans, betting that his heavier guns and the galleasses would disrupt their attack enough to give the Christian fleet an advantage in the close-range fighting that would follow. The Ottoman fleet deployed into a similar line formation, but with a crucial difference. Ali Pasha extended his line farther, attempting to overlap the Christian wings and envelop them. The Ottoman line was stretched thinner but longer, a classic attempt to outflank the enemy. Ali Pasha commanded the center with his flagship, the Sultana. His left wing, commanded by Mehmed Sirocco, would attack Barbarigo's Venetian squadron. His right wing, commanded by Uluj Ali, would attack Doria's squadron. Both sides were now committed. Thousands of rowers strained at their oars, driving the galleys forward. The distance between the fleets closed. A mile, half a mile, quarter mile. On the Christian galleys, soldiers checked their weapons. Arquebusiers prepared their matches. Gun crews loaded their cannons. Priests moved through the ships, blessing the men and hearing final confessions. Some soldiers prayed. Others sang. The rowers, chained to their benches, could only wait. On the Ottoman galleys, the scene was similar. Muslim imams led prayers. Archers strung their bows. Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, prepared their weapons and armor. The rowers pulled harder, knowing that in minutes they might be dead. And then at around 10:30 in the morning, the battle began. The galleasses fired first. The Ottoman galleys surged forward, expecting to crash into the Christian line in the traditional manner. Instead, they ran into the 6 galleasses, positioned like island fortresses in their path. The effect was devastating. The galleasses opened fire with dozens of cannons, raking the approaching Ottoman galleys from multiple angles. Heavy balls smashed through oars, killing rowers and crippling ships. Lighter guns swept the decks with grapeshot, cutting down soldiers and sailors. The Ottoman galleys couldn't effectively return fire. Their bow-mounted guns were designed to fire straight ahead, but the galleasses were positioned to fire broadsides. Several Ottoman galleys were disabled before they even reached the Christian line. Others swerved to avoid the galleasses, breaking their formation and creating gaps. It was exactly what Don Juan had planned, but the Ottomans kept coming. There were too many of them to be stopped by 6 galleasses, no matter how well armed. The main Ottoman line crashed into the Christian fleet, and the battle dissolved into hundreds of individual ship-to-ship combats. In the center of the battle line, Don Juan's flagship, the Real, came bow to bow with Ali Pasha's Sultana. This wasn't coincidence. Both commanders had steered directly toward each other. In galley warfare, the flagships attracting meant that the decisive fighting would happen here, in the center, where both commanders could directly control the action. The 2 galleys fired their bow cannons almost simultaneously. The Real's heavy cannon punched through the Sultana's bow structure, smashing oars and killing rowers. The Sultana's lighter guns scored hits on the Real's deck, wounding several soldiers. Then the galleys crashed together. Grappling hooks flew. Boarding planks slammed down. Soldiers surged across, and the fighting became brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Ottoman Janissaries were fearsome warriors, elite troops with years of training and battle experience. They wore armor, wielded scimitars and axes, and fought with fanatical courage. They poured onto the Real's deck, driving back the Spanish soldiers. But the Spanish had those arquebusiers. Massed volleys of arquebus fire swept the boarding parties. At close range, the heavy balls smashed through armor and bodies. Ottoman soldiers fell in heaps, but more kept coming, climbing over their dead comrades to reach the Christian soldiers. For over an hour, the 2 flagships remained locked together, with control of the decks shifting back and forth. Ali Pasha fought personally, rallying his men. Don Juan did the same, his armor covered in blood, some his own, most not. Around them, the center squadrons of both fleets crashed together in a chaotic melee. Galleys rammed each other, grappled together, or came alongside to exchange fire. The water between the ships filled with debris, wounded men and bodies. The Christian heavy cannons were proving their worth. Again and again, the heavier guns on the Christian galleys would smash through Ottoman oars and disable their ships before they could close. But once the fighting became hand-to-hand, the Ottoman numerical advantage in soldiers began to tell. The center was hanging in the balance. While the center ground into a bloody stalemate, the action on the flanks would decide the battle. On the northern flank, Barbarigo's Venetian squadron was in trouble. Mehmed Sirocco's Ottoman squadron had nearly succeeded in outflanking them, working their galleys into the shallows near the shore where the Venetians couldn't maneuver easily. Barbarigo himself was wounded by an arrow to the eye, a mortal wound, though he would linger for 2 days before dying. His flagship was being overwhelmed by Ottoman boarders when Venetian reinforcements arrived and drove them back. The fighting here was desperate. The Venetians were outnumbered and being outmaneuvered. Several of their galleys were captured. It looked like the northern flank might collapse entirely. But the Venetians had 2 advantages: desperation and familiarity with these waters. They knew every shoal and sandbar. Some of their galleys deliberately ran aground in the shallows, making it impossible for Ottoman galleys to approach from certain angles. Others formed tight defensive clusters, presenting bristling walls of pikes and arquebusiers to any attempt at boarding. And, crucially, the reserve squadron under Santa Cruz saw the danger and sent galleys north to reinforce. The Ottoman attack on the northern flank stalled. Sirocco's galleys were now spread out, some in the shallows, some engaged with Venetian galleys, some trying to navigate around obstacles. The unified assault had become a confused brawl on the southern flank. Something very different was happening. Uluj Ali, commanding the Ottoman right wing, was the most experienced admiral in either fleet. He was a renegade, a Calabrian fisherman who'd been captured by Ottoman corsairs as a young man, converted to Islam, and risen through the ranks to become one of the most feared commanders in the Mediterranean. He'd been fighting naval battles for decades, and he immediately saw what Doria was doing wrong. Doria had extended his line southward to prevent being outflanked, but in doing so he'd stretched it too thin. Gaps had opened between his galleys. Worse, he'd pulled too far south, opening a gap between his squadron and Don Juan's center. Uluj Ali saw the opportunity and struck like lightning. He feinted toward the southern end of Doria's line, drawing the Spanish and Genoese galleys even farther south. Then he suddenly turned north with his fastest galleys and drove straight for the gap between Doria's squadron and the center. It was a brilliant maneuver. Uluj Ali's galleys punched through the gap and fell on the rear of Don Juan's center squadron, attacking galleys that were already engaged to their front. Several Christian galleys were overwhelmed and captured, including the flagship of the Knights of Malta. The southern flank was collapsing. If Uluj Ali could maintain his momentum, he might roll up the entire Christian center from the flank. But Santa Cruz was watching. The reserve squadron under Santa Cruz had been waiting for exactly this moment, a crisis that required immediate reinforcement. Santa Cruz didn't hesitate. He threw his fresh galleys into the gap that Uluj Ali had created, meeting the Ottoman attack head-on. The impact was decisive. Uluj Ali's galleys, which had been driving deep into the Christian rear, suddenly found themselves facing fresh troops, loaded cannons, and commanders who weren't panicking. The Ottoman advance stalled. Meanwhile, back in the center, the fight between the Real and the Sultana was reaching its climax. For over an hour, the 2 flagships had been locked together in brutal combat. The decks were slippery with blood. The wounded and dead were piled so thick that soldiers were fighting on top of bodies. Both commanders were still alive, still fighting, still rallying their men. And then Spanish reinforcements arrived. Several galleys from Don Juan's center squadron had fought free of their opponents and converged on the 2 flagships. Fresh Spanish soldiers poured onto the Sultana's deck, overwhelming the exhausted Ottoman defenders. Ali Pasha was wounded, then wounded again. As he tried to rally his men, an arquebus ball took him in the head. The Ottoman admiral fell dead on his own deck. His death changed everything. Ottoman soldiers, seeing their commander fall, began to waver. Spanish soldiers, energized by success, pressed harder. Within minutes, the Sultana was captured, and Ali Pasha's severed head was mounted on a pike and raised above the deck. The sight was visible across much of the battle. Ottoman galleys that had been pressing their attacks now hesitated. Christian galleys that had been on the defensive surged forward. The psychological impact was enormous. In a battle where command and control were already difficult, the visible death of the Ottoman commander created confusion and fear. On the northern flank, The Venetians and their reinforcements began pushing back Sirocco's squadron. Several Ottoman galleys were captured. Others began pulling back toward the shore. Sirocco himself was captured wounded and barely alive. On the southern flank, Ulugh Ali realized the battle was lost. He was too experienced a commander to throw his ships away in a hopeless cause. He ordered his surviving galleys to disengage and retreat, but disengaging from a galley battle wasn't easy. His galleys were intermixed with Christian galleys, many grappled together. Pulling back meant abandoning ships that were still engaged. Ulugh Ali made the hard choice. He took his fastest galleys, perhaps 30 or 40 ships that were able to break contact, and fled east. He left behind dozens of galleys still fighting, now doomed without support. The Ottoman fleet was breaking. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. With their command structure shattered and their fleet breaking apart, Ottoman galleys throughout the battle area tried to escape. Some ran for the shore where their crews abandoned ship and fled inland. Others tried to retreat eastward, rowing desperately toward the Gulf of Lepanto. The Christian galleys pursued. This is where the true horror of galley warfare becomes apparent. When a galley was captured or destroyed, the rowers, chained to their benches, had no escape. Christian rowers on captured Ottoman galleys might be freed by their co-religionists, but Muslim rowers died at their oars, either killed in the fighting or drowning when their ships sank. The same fate awaited Christian rowers on Ottoman galleys that went down. Thousands of rowers died this way. They weren't soldiers. Many weren't even willing participants in the battle. But they died all the same, chained to benches on sinking ships. The Ottoman fleet was annihilated. Of the roughly 230 Ottoman galleys that entered battle, perhaps 50 escaped with Ulugh Ali. About 130 were captured. Another 50 were sunk or destroyed. Ottoman casualties were staggering, perhaps 30,000 killed, including 8,000 drowned rowers, plus another 8,000 captured. The Christian fleet lost only about 15 galleys, though many more were damaged. Casualties were also heavy, around 7,500 killed and 7,500 wounded, but nothing like the Ottoman losses. The Mediterranean was littered with wreckage. Bodies floated everywhere. The water was literally red with blood for miles around. Among the Christian dead was the famous author Miguel de Cervantes, who served as a soldier on a Spanish galley. Actually, that's not quite right. Cervantes was wounded at Lepanto, losing the use of his left hand, but he survived. He would later write that he'd prefer to have been present at Lepanto, even with his injury, than to have missed the greatest occasion that past or present ages have seen. As the sun set on October 7th, 1571, the Holy League fleet controlled the Gulf of Patras. The Ottoman fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean for a century, had been destroyed. The news would electrify Christian Europe. When word of the victory reached Rome, the Pope wept with joy. Church bells rang throughout Italy. Celebratory masses were held. The victory was credited to the intercession of the Virgin Mary, and October 7th was declared the Feast of Our Lady of Victory, later changed to the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. In Spain, King Philip II received the news with his characteristic restraint, but he authorized celebrations throughout his kingdoms. Don Juan became a hero, feted and praised wherever he went. Venice celebrated, but with an undercurrent of bitterness. They'd lost Barbarigo, one of their finest admirals. And while the Ottoman fleet had been destroyed, Cyprus was still lost. Famagusta had finally fallen in August 1571, just weeks before Lepanto. The Venetians had won the battle but lost the war. In Constantinople, the news was devastating. Sultan Selim the Kun had lost his fleet, his admiral, and tens of thousands of men. The invincible Ottoman Navy had been crushed, but here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Ottomans rebuilt. Within months, the shipyards of the Ottoman Empire were working at full capacity. By the spring of 1572, a new fleet of over 200 galleys had been constructed. The Ottoman Grand Vizier famously told the Venetian ambassador, "You come to see how powerful we are. In capturing Cyprus, we cut off one of your arms. In defeating our fleet, you shaved our beard. An arm once cut off cannot grow again, but a beard once shaved grows back thicker." He was right. The Holy League, despite its great victory, couldn't maintain unity. Spain was distracted by other concerns. Venice, exhausted and financially drained, made a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, formally ceding Cyprus. The Pope's efforts to organize another crusade fell apart. The various Christian powers went back to their usual pattern of competing with each other, sometimes even allying with the Ottomans against other Christians. So did Lepanto matter? Historians have debated this for 4.5 centuries. Some argue that Lepanto was strategically meaningless. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet. Venice lost Cyprus anyway. Within a few years, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean looked much like it had before the battle. But that's too simple. Lepanto shattered a myth: Ottoman naval invincibility. For a century, Christian powers had feared the Ottoman fleet. That fear was gone after Lepanto. The psychological impact was enormous. More importantly, Lepanto marked the high water mark of Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. After 1571, the Ottomans never again mounted a major offensive in the Western Mediterranean. They rebuilt their fleet, yes, but they used it primarily for defensive purposes and for operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The balance of power had shifted. Even if that shift wasn't immediately obvious, there's also a technological legacy. The battle proved the value of heavy bow-mounted cannons and the devastating effectiveness of massed arquebus fire. Future Mediterranean galleys would be designed with these lessons in mind. The galleasses, the Venetian hybrid ship that proved so effective in disrupting the Ottoman attack, represented the future. Within a few decades, sailing ships with heavy broadside armaments would begin to replace galleys as the dominant warship type in European navies. The age of the galley, which had lasted for thousands of years, was ending. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural. Lepanto became a defining moment in European consciousness. It was celebrated in art, literature, and music. The battle inspired countless paintings, poems, and histories. For generations, European children learned about Don Juan and the heroic victory over the Turks. This cultural memory reinforced a sense of Christian European identity in opposition to the Islamic Ottoman Empire. The Mediterranean became not just a strategic contest, but a civilizational boundary. This had profound implications for how Europeans would view themselves and the wider world in the centuries to come. So what really decided the Battle of Lepanto? It wasn't just courage, though both sides fought with incredible bravery. It wasn't just numbers. The forces were relatively evenly matched. It wasn't even leadership, though Don Juan proved surprisingly capable for such a young commander. The real story is about technology and innovation. The Christian fleet had 3 crucial advantages: the galleasses that disrupted the Ottoman attack, the heavier bow-mounted cannons that gave them a firepower edge, and the massed arquebusiers who dominated the close-range fighting. These weren't revolutionary technologies. Both sides had cannons, both sides had firearms, but the Christians had integrated these technologies more effectively into their naval doctrine. The Venetians in particular had been innovating for decades, constantly improving their galley designs and incorporating new weapons. The Spanish had perfected the use of arquebusiers through years of land warfare and had successfully adapted these tactics to naval combat. The Ottomans, despite their many strengths, had become somewhat conservative in their naval technology. They were still relying on tactics and ship designs that had worked well for a century. They hadn't kept pace with European innovations in gunpowder weapons. This technological gap wasn't enormous, but in a battle between roughly equal forces, small advantages compound. There's also a question of motivation. The Christian fleet was fighting close to home, defending their own territories. They knew that defeat might mean Ottoman fleets raiding the Italian coast, perhaps even threatening Rome itself. The Ottoman fleet was fighting far from Constantinople, on the strategic offensive rather than defending their homeland. In a close battle, that psychological difference mattered, and finally, there was the crucial moment when Santa Cruz committed the reserve squadron to plug the gap that Ulugh Ali had created. That decision probably saved the Christian fleet from defeat. If Ulugh Ali had been able to roll up the Christian center from the flank, the entire battle might have gone the other way. Strategic reserves matter. Having fresh troops available to exploit opportunities or shore up weak points is a fundamental principle of warfare that applied as much on the waters of the Mediterranean in 1571 as on any modern battlefield. The Battle of Lepanto was the last great galley battle in history. Within a few decades, the oared warship that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for 3,000 years would be obsolete, replaced by sailing ships with broadside cannons. But on October 7, 1571, the galley had one last moment of glory. 300 of these ancient vessels clashed in the largest naval battle in centuries. By sunset, the Ottoman fleet that had dominated the Mediterranean for a century was gone. The Ottomans would rebuild, and the strategic situation would stabilize. But something had changed. The tide of Ottoman expansion had been stopped. The Mediterranean would never again be an Ottoman lake, and all because of the galleys, those long, narrow, vulnerable ships, powered by human muscle and armed with the latest gunpowder weapons. Ships that combined ancient design with modern technology. Ships that, at Lepanto, crushed the Ottoman Navy and changed the course of history. The age of the galley was ending. But it ended with the largest, bloodiest, most decisive galley battle ever fought, and that's the real story of Lepanto.